what do I say? Just for no big deal.
There are a couple of questions after class when you're traveling, and they're such good questions that I would be remiss if I didn't share the questions and the answers with the rest of you. I mean, some of you are struggling nicely with this stuff. You can learn as much from each other. Sometimes you can learn more from each other than you can from me, so I'd like to share this. This is concerned in these commodities, the presence of markets, where there is this communist fundamental class process. So here, just to remind you, here we have something revolutionary and it's new, which is that the collectivity of workers are in a position to appropriate and distribute the surpluses they produce. So simply put, the workers that produce the profits get the profits that they produce. Hear the language. The workers that produce the profits get the profits that they produce, and hence they're in the position to distribute. They're the first distributors because they're the first appropriators of the surplus. That's the revolutionary idea. Suppose that occurs along with markets. Production of commodities for sale, whether it be the input side or output side, doesn't make a difference. We'll generalize it. It occurs together with markets. So what I'm doing here is I'm not equating capitalism with markets. We've done something different in this course. We're not equating capitalism with private ownership of the means of production, or with the presence of those two. We're doing something different. We're equating capitalism with the presence or absence of class exploitation. The workers appropriate and produce their own and distribute their own surplus, then there is not this kind of private exploitation present. Okay, so we have markets. Now, economists, ever since markets were first invented, have kind of understood that markets cycle. I mean, this is not new news. It's been going on for a long time. So when you introduce competitive markets, you have the possibility of ups and downs. Unfortunately, it's very unfortunate, economics has split over the years of the centuries into two camps. One camp says that markets only deliver good things. They only equilibrate. The other camp says markets only deliver bad things. They're always out of control. First one is micro theory. The second one is macro theory. Nothing to do with Marxism. Just bear in mind, it's not an either or, it's both. So when you have supply and demand competitive markets, they both tend to an equilibrium, and they also tend to get out of equilibrium. Suppose then we have markets present in communism. It wouldn't be surprising then, I wouldn't be surprised, if we had the possibility of both of these tendencies, we had both of these tendencies present, and the possibility of having a recession or depression, whatever. Because that's what markets do. Why? That's what we went through in the class. That tableau I put on the blackboard, in which those capitalists are competing with one another, presented us with the possibility of a declining profit rate and a downturn. So on your first exam, which you'll get on Tuesday after the break, you'll be asked a question about that. How is it possible for a market society to produce a downturn? You have to use that tableau to struggle over super profits to answer that question. The very incentives of a market present us with a wonderful thing, which is a rise in productivity of labor, but also present us with a bad thing, which is a recession and the fall in productivity of labor. Both things occur, it's not one, either way. So in communism, we have the possibility of this recession if we have markets. By the way, I don't want to lose it. If we have planning, you will also have good and bad things. It's not as if planning is going to solve this dilemma. Nothing can solve this dilemma. That's life. We're going to examine planning in a moment with this guy, Novak, so I'm going to leave that aside. Suppose then, we got this communist fundamental class process, as I said to you last time, we have markets, okay, present, and suppose it were the case, because of competition, or all, let's just take the example we did, because of competition, communist competition across the society, we have the possibility of declining communist profit rate, and hence, in segments of the economy, in factories and so forth, you have unemployed labor. Then what? So here is a response, a possible response. There's no inevitability. What I'm just going to tell you now is not necessary, but it's a possible response. The workers in this society could, these communist workers who are producing, appropriating, and distributing products, could have an understanding of what I just said. That would be part of their education. It would be part of their culture. That would give them a new understanding of the communist society with markets that they're operating under. And in order to deal with the possible frustrations and upset and anger of workers who would be unemployed in communism, they may set aside a social class, they may set aside an unemployment reserve to deal with these unemployed workers. Okay? So let me use the example that we had last time. Okay? We had workers that are laboring for a period of time, called little I, and they yielded a value. Except in communism, the workers, this is communism, the workers received the total value added, paid themselves a wage, and then had a surplus. And they need that surplus to produce the social glue to hold the communism together. So I think I had 8 hours of work. What did I have? 2 billion? I can't remember what I had. I had 2 billion here. And so this is 2 billion over the 8 hours. So over the 8 hours of labor of these communist workers, 8 hours, they produce 2 billions of value added in economic terms. Okay. 1/4 billion every hour over the 8. And they have a total of 2 billion. They decide they were going to work to deal with this problem. They make the decision they're going to work 9 hours. They're going to work more hours. They're in the position to make that decision. So they work 9 hours. I'll assume the yield is the same. Okay? So now I have 18, 9 times 2 is 18 over 8. 16 and 2 days. So we have 2 1/4 more billions of dollars that these workers now have. They take this extra 1/4 and they set up $1/4 of $1 billion, a reserve for unemployed labor. So they still have the 2 billion over here that they had before, but they now have another 1/4 of $1 billion. So 2 1/4. And they take that extra billion, but why do they have it, by the way? Because they're working a longer day, 9 hours rather than 8. And they distribute it and take care of those people who pay a penalty for having a market economy. That's what this is. They tax themselves, they're in the position to tax themselves, these workers, to pay those people. Why? Because they decide, in one way or the other, they want this market communism to continue. But they understand this sophisticated nuance, that they have the possibility of this. It's a possibility. Because as I showed you before, it's not necessary for that profit rate to fall. But if it does, and you start cutting back and have unemployed labor, then you have the wherewithal to take care of these individuals because of this recession. Now, I gave you a lecture on Marx and how he thought people acted under a capitalist commodity-producing society. You remember, and it's difficult to remember everything. His argument was that in capitalism, the individuals of capitalism, including the workers, make a fetish of the market. They worship the market. They allow that market to have an independent existence, it's like a god, and they allow the market to determine their lives. And they forget that it's they who created the markets. They forget that step. And they allow the markets to determine their lives, and so they begin to worship the market. You've got something very different. In this situation, you have something different. What's the difference? Well, here, people understand that the market shapes their lives. It can create unemployment. But because of the presence of the communist fundamental class process of the education, a different kind of culture, and so forth, etc., you now also have the possibility that the workers can try and shape the consequences of the market. That's a degree of, if you want democracy, it's a degree of freedom under communism that's not present under capitalism. That's a direct intervention by the workers in the market. That's an easy, because that came up after class in terms of one of the questions. So let me now compare and contrast this communism and capitalism before I turn to Mr. Novak. We have in both societies the surplus, otherwise you wouldn't have a society. Capitalism communism. So we have in both society workers laboring above and beyond necessary to produce a surplus, but that's social glue. It's a different kind of glue in these different societies, but you still need a surplus. Now you're going to take courses, some of you, in anthropology, and they'll say no surplus for a particular kind of primitive, so-called primitive society. That's different from what I'm teaching you. I understand that, so you've got a problem on your hands. Okay. For Marx, there's got to be a surplus if there is a society. That provides all the conditions of existence for the surplus to exist in the first place. So they both have in common. What's the difference then? The difference then in this society, the workers produce it as a collectivity, but the workers also appropriate it as a collectivity, and hence are in a position to distribute it. That's a degree of freedom. They get what they produce, and they distribute, which they get. That's not the case in capitalism. So the surplus still has to be distributed to all the different subsumed classes in these two societies. Here, the workers have to distribute the surplus to all the communist subsumed classes to make sure that surplus exists and grows over time. In the same way, the surplus is received by the board of directors, but the board of directors didn't produce it. So the board of directors does distribute it to secure all of the conditions of existence of the capitalist appropriation of surplus. That's a big difference. Here the workers have a sense of empowerment that they do not here. Third, is it possible that the technology and so forth, etc., could be at a level that creates enormous wealth? Of course. We think of our society. This is not an indictment, it's not a critique of the industrialization of the society. It's how the value is produced, appropriated, and distributed. There's no question that capitalism has unleashed the forces of production. You read that in Mr. Engels. Is it possible for this to unleash the forces of production? Of course. But this is a different kind of argument. It's connecting technology to the fundamental and subsumed class processes. That was Marx's end. Finally, can you have a capitalism with collective ownership of the means of production and planning? Of course you can. Of course, what's the big deal? You can have a capitalism without private ownership of the means and without markets. During World War II, we ran a very successful capitalism in the United States with very few free markets. The biggest market in the United States today is not free. It's planned. It's called a labor market. There's a minimum wage. It's not a free market. OPEC is a market in oil which is controlled by maybe, 15 countries. That's not a free market. Is it still viable with capitalism? Of course it is. Can you have collective ownership and still have private capitalism? Yes. I already did that in class. Is it possible to have communism with private ownership and markets? Yes, we just did it. So once again, on this last point, don't conflate the class processes with their conditions of existence. They're connected, but they're different. It would be conflating, an ice cream cone with an elephant. They're both important, but they're different. They affect one another. But they're still different. So the class process is different than its conditions of existence. The conditions of existence would be the markets, private ownership, power, and so forth, etc. Last, okay, so now Mr. Novak. Let me get to Alec Novak, N-O-V-A. He writes a book called The Economics of Feasible Socialism. Fascinating book, and you're going to like this, okay, when you read it. I know it's going to appeal to a lot of you, because I know from your questions from past history. It's a book that will appeal to some, not all, but some. He died just a few years ago. He was a well-known, in fact, he's probably a famous British economist and expert on the former USSR and socialist countries around the world. And when he was alive, he was probably the foremost expert on socialism, alive at that day. And he was the author of many, many books and articles. He did write a lot of books like that on the economic history of the former Soviet Union. And one of those books was the most widely used book on the economic history of the USSR. It was called An Economic History of the USSR. And I don't know how many, it's like 11 or 12 editions. Just a very famous book. He was a non-Marxist. He did not like Marxism. He broke from the Soviet Union, came to Britain to write his stuff. He was no Marxist. He was not friendly to it. But he was sympathetic to socialism. That is, he was sympathetic to his idea of what is socialism. And he was very critical of capitalism. So this book represents his view of what is called nowadays market socialism. It's that which is very, very popular still to this day in many countries around the world, but especially in Western Europe. When you visit there, you have coffee with people your age, they'll talk about market socialism, and now you have something to talk to them about when you try to hook up with them. I'm just joking. So this Nove's ideas here of market socialism, or sometimes what's called democratic socialism, was very popular in the West, but not so much popular in the former Soviet Union. So this is really a theory for Sweden, for Denmark, and Australia, New Zealand, and for France, Italy, and so forth, but not really for Russia or for Poland or whatever. Novy begins his book with what he understands to be Marxian theory, and that theory's view of socialism. So just Engels and Kautsky and Bernstein, people who confront Lenin. And why I'm going to spend exactly 30 seconds with that. The only reason that's important to your attention is to write about something. That author confronts the literature, confronts what other people write. And so the author then has to do two things. One, connect him or herself to that literature, and of course, disassociate himself or herself with that literature. The last step is when the author says, I'm doing something new and different. Otherwise, you wouldn't write the book. So Nove is confronting then the existing literature on socialism, and he wants to disassociate himself with this and do something new, which he calls a feasible, a practical socialism for today's world. But there's no question that he desires socialism. He doesn't like the capitalisms of the day. But very careful now. What he desires is his notion of socialism. He doesn't want Engels' notion. He doesn't want Kautsky's notion. He comes closer to Bernstein. So he's going to produce, that's what we're doing in this course, he's producing his view of socialism. And it's different from the one that I just presented, the surplus labor approach. Very different. So in this book, he tries to outline the contours of what he calls a feasible socialism. It's what he prefers, Mr. Norton. Again, what he wrote is very important in terms of the times. We had a big fall. What he doesn't like are the existing capitalisms of the day, including in England and the United States. He doesn't like the existing socialisms of the day that were practiced in East European countries, in Cuba, and in the former USSR. Okay, so he died in the 1990s, if I remember correctly. So I'll stop with, what's his dislike of capitalism all about, and I'll do his dislike of socialism. So first let's take his dislike of capitalism. He says, this is his argument. He says, in the capitalism of the day, so what do you have as images in the United States? He says, he argues, there's too much monopoly power concentrated in a whole series of key industries and very large unions. So his image of is what's happened in the United States is that the competitive market has given way to a kind of monopolization of power by a few corporate bosses, unknown bosses sitting in these corporations, and unknown union leaders who basically control much of the economy. And these individuals, when they wield their power, the union bosses and the corporate bosses, when they wield their power, they make the economy and all the rest of us explicitly vulnerable to their decisions. So the decisions of the few control the lives of the many. Too much power is in too few hands over prices and wages. That's one of his critiques. Here's the second one. So there's two of these. First, got that? Everyone have that now? The second, he says what's happened also in capitalism, in addition to this concentration of power in the hands of a few, what has also happened is that people are getting rewards in capitalism, income rewards, which bear very little resemblance to their contribution to society. The distribution of income and wealth bear little resemblance to the recipients of that enormous amount of income and wealth to making possible the wealth in the first place. So people, whether it be by birth or conniving or politics or manipulation in various markets and so forth, they receive enormous payoffs, millions of dollars a year, way beyond, above and beyond anything they ever did to warrant such a reward. And the consequence of that is that it tends to breed an alienation, in his words, in society. People get alienated from each other and from society, alienated from their civic responsibilities and so forth, because they see too much wealth going to these, I'm not going to coin this, you've heard this, wise guys. people who got birth manipulation, financial manipulation, and so forth, state manipulation get too much for doing too little. And the cost of that is that we give up. We don't work as hard as we do. We lose confidence in the system. Okay, so let me explain this to his solutions. He says, look, this concentration of power in the hands of these few large corporations and these unions, they make the society very vulnerable to economic events. The first one he mentions is inflation. So the economy becomes vulnerable to the decisions of the few who have the power to raise prices and wages. Now, I just got to remind, don't get angry. I just got to remind you, in a competitive capitalism, or let me put it differently, competitive markets, what a competitive market means, by definition, is that no individual there has the power to raise its price. You all learned that the demand curve facing a firm is perfectly elastic. So the firm is a price taker. So I understand the geometry, the fancy geometry. In English, that means no firm can raise its price. So the market is a dictator. And every firm is a price taker. Whereas if you have a monopoly, they have something quite different. Then the firm has the power to alter its price. It's operating in economic theory with a marginal revenue curve. So the demand curve is not perfectly elastic. Anyway, anything on that? I can't read your faces, so I'm not sure. Okay. So we have these large firms that can bump up prices if they want, and we have the unions that can bump up wages. What happens, he argues, is that the Federal Reserve Board, which controls the money supply, more often than not, will respond to higher prices and wages by these powerful groups and increase the money supply to help finance higher prices and wages, to help push it. So the state, rather than controlling it, becomes an institution in society that is controlled by these monopolists and these unions. Because it just goes along with the higher prices. So, in the 1960s and 70s into the 80s, we had almost 25 to 30 years of experience in this. What happened then, according to Novy, he says unions pushed up wages. They had the power to do that. You didn't have a competitive labor market. You had unions intervening to push up wages. And then you had these large corporations who had to pay higher wages, and in turn they had the power to raise their prices, which encouraged unions to raise their wages, which encouraged, we had a inflation. A price-wage spiral, it was called, in the 60s and 70s, during the Vietnamese War, well, right into the 70s, up until President Reagan took office. It was stopped, finally, it was stopped. So it was arrested and then stopped by the Federal Reserve Board. Finally, people argued, having the courage to not pump up the money supply. And so what the Fed did was tighten the money supply, increased interest rates really dramatically. I can't remember, something like 11, 14, 15%. In the late 70s and 80s. It's just to stop this. And that caused, in turn, the most severe recession since the Great Depression. I understand the most severe one is not, but this is before. So Novy looks at this and says, this is crazy. Look at what happened here. We've had these powerful unions and companies, steel company, rubber workers, blah, 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 so forth, etc. UAW, iron field companies. They have all this power. They raise their prices, they raise their wages. The Fed went along with it, and then finally, we had I can't remember the guy's name, we had the Fed intervening and finally stopping it in the 1980s. reducing the money supply, but that caused a recession. Because he says this is not an efficient way to run the society. So that's one argument, okay? You could play that argument today with these oil prices. If you understand the price of gasoline, it's not a competitive market. OPEC sets the price, it sets the price. And then the refiners of oil, they buy that oil, they transform the oil into gasoline for our cars and for industry. That's not a competitive market either. There's just very few of them. And so the economy is becoming explicitly vulnerable in our recovery period to this rising prices of a very important input called energy. So it's possible to bring it to a halt. People worry about it. So that's no big deal. There's not much that they can do about it. I mean, what's the alternative? You could seize the oil wells in the Middle East or in Mexico or Nigeria. You could break up the oil, the refining companies, take them away from Jersey. No one talks about those things. So nobody's saying this is a problem, whether it be in the 60s, the 70s, or today. Second problem. Okay? Second problem. He says the second problem is that these, and he does this now on the corporate side. He says the second problem is that these, the largest corporations make investment decisions that control the entire economy. So here's his image here. He said a few capitalists, people sitting on the boards of directors of the largest corporations in the United States. It's what's called Fortune's 500. Fortune magazine does a sample of the 500 largest corporations in the United States. And it examines their value added, their employment, and so forth. And these 500 largest corporations, they produce something like, they produce something like 3/4 of the value added in the United States. It's very, so most of the value added is produced by these very few companies. Not employment, but value added. So it's not a country of small business. That's bullshit. It's a country in which the largest corporations produce most of the value added. But when you do employment, that's something else. That is small business. So he says that the 500 largest corporations, we're not talking about a lot of people, 500 times 20, talking about 10,000 people in the United States make decisions, and it's even less than that because the same person sits on more than one board. So they have interlocking boards of directors. So you get the same person on 2, 3 boards. So it's up to, say, 10,000 people, but likely much less, are making decisions about how much they should invest. And those decisions, by those few individuals, control the population of 150 million people in the workforce. That's not democracy, says Mr. Nolan. What does he have in mind? Well, we've done this before in this course. He's saying that He's saying the investment by these 500 largest corporations it collapses. Suppose investment falls. Then, we as a multiplier, he makes use of that, so this is your multiplier, it can be a big change in the economy. So if this falls by, say the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. It's actually a bit higher in the United States. If it's 0.9, then this number is 1 minus 0.1, so this is 10. If this falls by $50 billion, that doesn't sound like a lot in a $13 trillion economy, but nonetheless, if that falls, then you have a $500 billion decline in the national economy. That's called a recession. $500 billion. So Mr. Nobe says, look, if the boards of directors make a decision, there's not many people here, if they make a decision to cut their investment, then via the multiplier, you can have a recession. The economy is explicitly vulnerable to the decisions of the few. Okay, next step is, why might that happen? Why might these few business people decide to cut their investment in plant and equipment and inventories and give rise to it? It's an unintended effect. mean, this is not intended by any stretch of the imagination. This is an unintended effect. Okay? No one plans this, that would be silly. It's just that that's what the multiplier is here. Now, here, Mr. Nove follows the work of Keynes. And so Keynes made an argument which Nove is accepting. And the argument is as follows. It's a very interesting argument. Keynes argued, Mr. Nove is affirming this, that the investment by business is very shifting. It shifts all over the place. It's affected, I'm going to use my language actually, it's only determined by everything that you can possibly think. Keynes argued in his book, The General Theory, that business was subject to what he called animal spirits. That's everything. Everything can change investment. Let me give you an example. Okay? Investment by a corporation is a function of the cost of capital. Right? It may invest more when the cost is very small, goes to a bank, borrows, but it's also dependent upon, this is E, the expected profitability of that investment. So even if this is low, if the expected profitability is even lower, it's not going to invest. Now notice something. This is the present. You know what this is. This is the future. And since we are human beings and not gods, we have no idea about the future. This is a guess of the future. But look, the business person's guess about the future, what they expect to happen, is going to affect investment today. So, here's the thing. Suppose everything is going on nicely. We're in an expansion. Okay? So, that businesses are happy, and so forth, etc. Everything looks nice. All of a sudden, all of a sudden, the animal spirits change. Business begins to get worried. It doesn't take too many. Business starts to get worried about the future profitability, and hence decides it's not going to build new plant and equipment because it gets a little bit scary. Why? Because of the expansion. The business have finally figured out, having lived through all these cycles, that there are cycles. And so as the expansion continues, they began to say, this is not going to continue. We better cut back just a little bit. And if they start to cut back just a little bit, it has a multiplier effect on the entire economy. So they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're acting as prudent business people. But that prudence has an unintended effect to create the possibility of a recession. Let me give you another one. They're investing, things are doing well, and so forth, but then there is a crisis in the Middle East. The crisis in the Middle East doesn't directly affect the business of refrigerators, but they get scared. I get scared. You get scared. 9/11, that horror, didn't have much of an impact on the U.S. economy, but boy, did it change people's moods. It wasn't just the airplane industry that suffered. It was the threat of a recession. Everybody understood at the time. Because people's moods turned sour. There was worries in the land. And the stock market is going up. Go back to my first case. The stock market is taking off. Everybody's investing in the market. You all know. And don't forget the lesson for the future when you have some money. You will begin to worry about that increase in prices and begin to get out when the market's going up. You don't get out when the market is down. You sell at the high price, not the low price. That's the same thing with business, okay? So anything in the society, the assassination of somebody, an oil crisis, the potentiality of war, a report by a government authority that we're running out of oil, whatever, can change the climate of people's expectations about the future, and they can begin to come back, cut that. By the same logic, go the other way, an expansion. The discovery of a new oil reserve in a particular part of the world, people become euphoric. It may have absolutely no impact on the sale of shoes, but people become happy because they hear that there's a possible new supply of oil, a new cancer drug, a president that favors business, a cutback in Social Security, whatever it is. The mood in the society changes, including the mood of business. So Keynes worried about this. He said at any moment, the demand for investment can collapse because of pessimism, or the demand for investment can rise because of euphoria. Because the business is always dealing with the future. You understand? It's shiftable. It shifts all over the place, and it has a big possible impact on the economy. Expansions and recessions, that's the business cycle. Next. And this is very current now, the next one. Nobody's not alive to talk about this, but it's very current. What the heck do businesses do with their profits if they're cutting back? That's an interesting question. So let's examine that for a moment. Okay? Let's take business savings, their profits. It's called net corporate savings. That's their profits. What are they doing? Let's have two choices. I mean, they do lots of stuff with it. Let's have two choices. So this is what, after they pay all their subsumed classes, their managers, their taxes, their interest, they have two things left they can do with the money. So they paid all their subsumed class. They're taking care of all their subsumed classes, their managers, their merchants, R&D, and so forth, research and development. They can either invest in what? New plant and equipment. Okay, they can expand. Or they can, they can invest in other assets, financial assets. They can take their money, they can buy new plant and equipment and expand jobs in society, or I should say and/or, they can buy government bonds, gold, foreign securities, land. The board of directors then has a decision to make. After it's taken care of all its other subsumed class payments, then it's got this thing left. The question is, what does it do with it? Well, it can invest in plant and equipment, or it can hold or buy new. The delta means it can purchase not just new plant and equipment, added plant and equipment, they can purchase added assets. Suppose this is 100. Suppose this is 50, make it dramatic. This is 50 and this is 50. So it has, you ready now? It has diversified its portfolio into two different kinds of holdings. $50 billion of industrial assets, $50 billion of other financial assets. He gets scared. With all the reasons that I gave you. President dies, there's an oil crisis, the stock market starts to fall, the Fed does, the government starts to do something, a million different reasons. So what it does then is reallocate its money to holding these financial assets. That can cause a recession. So the man that did this simple equation, this simple stuff, his name was Jim Tobin. He was a Keynesian, after Keynes. So he did this, and guess what he got for it? So simple. A Nobel Prize. After the simple equation, awarded him a Nobel Prize in economics. $1 million. That's how important this is. So let me finish that. So if businesses are switching their net corporate savings into other financial assets because they're getting scared. So nowadays, this is our problem. The corporations are flush with cash. And they're not investing as much as one would hope. Hence, they're not generating the jobs They're holding cash. And so the question is, how do you induce them to switch their portfolios from this to this? You think of a way that the state could try and encourage to switch them out of cash into industrial assets. Yeah?
Incentivize new investment.
Well, they can't do that because that's called private investment. Suppose they're holding government bonds. Yes?
They cut the interest rate.
Bravo. Do you understand what the Fed is doing? It was the biggest purchase of bonds in our history. That's exactly right. And that drives down the interest rate and makes the cost of holding cash very high. The opportunity cost becomes very high because you're not earning much money by holding this stuff. I think the interest rate in the long-term bonds is like 3%. You keep driving it down, and that encourages private investment because you can't. There are no laws that you can pass which will directly affect this, and it's in the future anyway. Unless you're a magician, you can't affect the future. But by driving the interest rate down, you make the cost of holding cash very high. That's why Mr. Tobin's contribution was not a minor one when it came to macroeconomics. He had a big influence on the head of the Federal Reserve Board. So this is, yes, now what's your question, man? I think you can see where Mr. Novak is going to go with this. Get all the steps in place. Okay, so Novak, to put everything together, again, he's saying then that that the economy, once again, is becoming vulnerable to these decisions of these few corporations and union leaders. Let me not lose that. By making, by influence affecting the decisions of the few, the rising inflation on the part of the capitalists themselves and their unions can create a situation in which people get scared about the future and they cut back. But the very expansion itself, even if it wasn't under inflationary conditions, can start to push corporations from changing their portfolio from I to A because they have an alternative of what to do with it. Hold cash, or they can buy bonds, both U.S. bonds or bonds from another country, or stocks, whatever the case may be. And so he says that this concentrated group power, via the multiplier effects, can create a disaster in capitalism. Next, pick up this other point. There's too much wealth going to the too few. Who, these too few, by birth, by political connections, by manipulating the stock market, by manipulating banks and insurance companies, get an enormous amount of wealth. What I just said to you is what's happened in the last 3 years. That's why so many people are so angry. It's even worse because they see that kind of financial manipulation being rewarded by the state. You've heard of it, too big to fail? You've heard that expression? These companies are so big, you can't afford to have them fail. And so the state steps in and gives the board of directors welfare to keep them alive at the same time that the board of directors have received and continue to receive millions of dollars in stock options and salaries and so forth. I don't know if you, there was a period just when we started to get into the recession when Congress was, the Senate were holding hearings on whether or not to be a bailout for the automobile companies. It was on TV. And so these people from the board of directors, the BOD, they showed up in Washington with their hands up, with their hats, or whatever expression you want to use, give us something. And the people on the Senate, the hearing, and these were the Republicans who did this, more than the Democrats. As people who normally would be friendly to business. first question we asked the people on the board of directors is, how did you get to Washington? I mean, how'd you get here from Detroit? And the answer was, well, I flew a private jet. Did you fly in a private jet? You see where this is going? And so the defendants, the people on the board of directors, they were criticized really heavily, made fun of. These people that other people worship, at that particular moment, were made to look like fools because they were asking for welfare when they flew in on private jets. People really got upset and outraged at this kind of action. And so they quickly learned their lesson. They didn't come down to Washington the next time on private jets. They came up and I took a train. It's a joke. Right? Somebody drove me. Whatever. So people are exquisitely sensitive to a lot of people getting a lot of money without doing much to warrant that kind of return. An unfair distribution of income and wealth. And that creates this kind of alienation and anger and upset. After, again, your Tea Party. Just incredibly upset and angry at this kind of corporate welfare. However it comes out, with the upsetness across the land, people work hard, but they nowhere receive the reward for their working hard compared to people who don't work hard and receive this enormous millions of dollars. And so you have this, why should I work hard? So, making my $600 a week, and that person is manipulating and acting like a wise guy and is making millions. And that's dangerous to a society. That's that wise guy phenomenon, which can undermine a society. Many societies have that. That's in part Egypt. People really got angry and upset on this crazy distribution of income for people who manipulated the system. Okay? So he says, look, to summarize this is Mr. Noble. He says there's a conflict between the private interests of individuals and the social interests. We have an uncontrolled market economy that can't handle the social interests. It can't handle the unintended effects of the market economy that he's describing. He calls them these diseconomies that the market economy can set in. There's macro, not micro, macro inefficiencies in modern capitalism. It's not just pollution, but it's also the inefficiency of the markets because these powerful groups, the corporations and the unions, work to promote their private interests and everybody else suffers. So everybody else suffers is this business cycle. So there's a difference, there's a conflict between the private interests of these small groups and the social interests of all of them. And capitalism can't solve that problem. Okay, then what's his notion of socialism that solves the problem? Socialism, then, is an alternative to this kind of private capitalism that he argues exists around the world. He says, what I want are three new features of my alternative socialism. Number one, I want to establish or reestablish competitive markets. It goes back to Adam Smith. So part of his proposal of a feasible socialism are competitive markets. That will give two things. Markets will give them the appropriate incentives to individuals, change, technology, and so forth, etc. Markets will also, as competitive markets, will also get rid of this too much power in too few hands. So he says markets are the best alternative that we now have to allocate the wealth in society. But, not fool, he understands that the market also creates the potentiality of the business cycle. Right? He just did that. So he says what we need to do then is control the markets so they do not create this diseconomy. So what he has in mind is a kind of Keynesian overall macro policy that would control the unintended effects of markets, the unintended effects being the business cycle, the uncontrolled ups and downs. Third, so there's your Keynes. So it's Smith the third aspect. He says, to break this craziness we have in society, when so much of the income and wealth goes to the so few that produces this alienation, this anger in society, let's have collective ownership of the means of production. Not everything, just the plants and equipment. Here's Mr. Engels. You want Marx, Engels, Hudson. So what he's got is a kind of socialist pancake. I don't know how else to describe it. It isn't called that. Which he combines together these three ingredients: collective ownership of the means of production, competitive markets, and Keynesian macro policy. That's his feasible socialism, or what some people call market socialism. Yes, sir.
How does he control the market?
Yes, you do a little louder.
How does he control the markets while keeping them competitive?
So, there are two steps. Okay, first step, you got to keep them competitive. So how do you compete? How do you make sure you have competitive markets? Here you have to, he's a radical on this, real radical. He wants to break up the large unions, and he wants to break up the large corporations. So there are a group of economists and political theorists who are on the right, and they are pro-competition, and they argue that we should, in order to get capitalism to function properly, and there would be a nobody's camp, you have to go after these groups that have too much power in their hands. So many of them were located for many years, I don't know about now, but for many years they were located at an institution in the Midwest, the University of Chicago. Okay? And they all, emanating from that school, the economists and the lawyers that they trained, were people that argued, you got to break up the monopolies. Break up General Motors, what's something important, break up Standard Oil in New Jersey, break up Microsoft, blah, blah. That didn't come from the left, that came from the right. I'm a little bit, before I get to my second point, I'm a little bit worried that this point, it's nothing to do with this course. Hey, what, you want to talk? Do I hear you? Some, no? Did you have a question? Maybe I just do this. It's not this course, but I just worry that this is a market. Okay? This is supply and demand. Price, quantity. What a market means, a competitive market, is that the market determines the price and the quantity bought and sold. So, the market is the addition of all the suppliers and the addition of all the demanders. And by an impersonal force, by demand and supply coming together, there is this price. This is the market equilibrium price. And if you get too high, where there's an excess supply, then competition sets in and the price falls here. If there's an excess demand, then price will rise. And eventually, there's a perfect balance between suppliers and demanders. It's common economics. Yes, sir?
So does he talk about making markets complete by including the external costs?
Okay, we can hold off. No, I will do that. Just hold off on that. So then the price is given to each firm. So in economics, you all learned that as the perfectly elastic demander, the little d. And there is your small supply, the marginal cost, and this is what a little q, what a firm produces. So the firm is a price taker. So that's competition. That's the idea of competition, the basic idea. What he's arguing is that we don't have this. That's the problem. We don't have this. What we have instead is that other graph that you learned. We have, for a firm, we have a demand curve that looks like that. So here a firm is a price maker. Okay? And this is the marginal revenue, and this is then the price that's charged for profit maximization. So notice, the price charged, this price in the monopoly situation is higher than the marginal cost. Here it's not. So this is inefficient, this is efficient. And he wants to get to this world and away from this world. And the way to get from this, away from this, is to break up the monopolies. So that's the source of antitrust legislation, Sherman Trust Law. They're all in the books. You can do this, it just has to be enforced. Every once in a while it gets enforced. Depends on the times. The last time this was really gone after was under Teddy Roosevelt in the United States, but there have been other times as well. So he wants this world. But when you have this world, as I showed you, you have the possibility of gyrations. So when you have the gyrations, then he wants the state, it's possible they have a recession so that this collapses. And some firms go out of business. So you have unemployment. So when that happens, he wants the state to deploy a macro policy of cutting taxes and raising government expenditures, running a deficit to offset the collapse of private investment. So then the state should intervene and increase state investment to offset the instability of private investment when this market collapses. And that's what you learned in 104. So he's deploying that idea. So he's trying to marry Keynes, the macro manipulation, with the micro efficiency of Mr. Smith. That's why it's an interesting idea. Now, your other question, does he handle the diseconomies and so forth?
No, the externalities.
The externalities. The only one that he handles, let me phrase this question again since it's so important. The question is, does Mr. Nove handle the externalities? The only one, let me explain to you externality. This firm, operating in this way, could create an external problem, external to it. It's doing everything that it should do. But it could create a problem outside of it. That's the economists come up with this word, external. So the example I just gave you, competitive firms could be operating like they're supposed to be doing, but they create, unintended, they create an external inefficiency called the business cycle. That's the only one he handles. So I'm going to give you a lecture when we come back and tell you why his idea has a problem, because it doesn't examine all the externalities. He only does one, which is fine. But I'm going to explain to you this in a minute. That he does not handle. And that's what we do. That undermines his argument. Any other questions on this? So this is how competition works. Okay, but the very fact we have competition, once again, the demand can collapse for all kinds of reasons. People no longer want to buy toothbrushes. They want to have electric toothbrushes, they no longer want the other ones, and you've got the people in the toothbrush industry are dead. People no longer want to buy American cars. So you get unemployment in Detroit and so forth, etc., and that can cause a recession. It goes on and on and on. Okay, so he is a what's called a social democrat. He wants the democracy of the market. Why is this democratic? This one over here. When you read this book, why is this an example of democracy? Economic, you know. Yeah.
People are making choices, and that's what the size of the choices are. So.
Absolutely. In this example over here, no one corporation has any power over price. No one has power over price. Why? Because everybody has power over price. That's what this says. You add up the suppliers and the demanders, you add them all up, and by the impersonal force of the market, the invisible hand, you determine a price. This is the visible hand. This is a particular corporation that sets that price in the market. So this is an example in which you decentralize power, and each individual has, just like you did, the choice of whether or not they want to buy the product, the choice of whether or not they're going to sell it, or produce and sell the product, and those individual, add up the individual choices, and you get the result. This is the choice of a producer. So he's arguing for this kind of democracy. This is going to be very important when he does planning. Okay? He's arguing for competition. Markets allow us to have this kind of democracy. He never did the following, but he could have. He might have even correlated this economic democracy with political democracy. He didn't do that, but other people have. The guy who followed that road, his name was Hayek, Hayek. He made an argument that these two kinds of democracies are correlated with one another. Yeah.
So would Nove claim that our market now is not competitive? Nove would claim that our market.
Many of our markets, yeah, that was an indictment of what he called liberal capitalism, that the markets are not, they're monopolistic, or whatever word you monopoly power, that's right. Any other things? I want to get to his critique and outbreak of the Soviet Union. Well, his critique of the Soviet Union is very similar to his critique of U.S. capitalism. It's very simple. He says in the former USSR and all the other socialist countries that he was interested in at the time, mainly East Europe and China and so forth, what the USSR had done, and other, Poland, Hungary, and so forth, they substituted a powerful, I'm going to add, powerful and dangerous state bureaucracy for the competitive market. They got rid of the competitive market and they used to do planning. And they might have had good intentions. He doesn't comment on that. Their intentions might be fine. But what they, in effect, what they did was they concentrated too much power in the hands of too few individuals located in the state to try and plan, organize, and control the entire economy. And he did, in this case, he did correlate this enormous economic power in the hands of a few with also political power. They became the most powerful individuals in those societies, often members of the secret Communist Party. So they not only did they have power over the prices and the quantities in society, but they also wielded enormous power over individuals in society as well, which is goods and services. Next, so planning creates a concentration of power. Associated with that is for him, a remarkable degree of inefficiency associated with planning. So here's his technical point. So he argues, look, it's impossible for a set of planners, no matter how powerful the computers, to ever be able to control all the decisions that take place in a complex industrial society. They just can't do it. The market can do a better job than the planners. That's what the market does. That's what the incentive of the market. But no human being, no matter how powerful the computers, can take into account all the complex interdependencies in a complex industrial society. It's always mistakes. And when you have mistakes, you get these bottlenecks. And the bottlenecks multiply, and you have these incredible inefficiencies result. You just can't figure it all out, and you can't react fast enough, these few individuals, no matter how clever they are, to the complexity of an economy. That's what a market does. That's the wonder of a market. It can, not a great job, it can do that. The problem is, the market may be pretty good in terms of the micro efficiencies, but it suffers on the macro. The planners, they deal with that macro business. Everybody's fully employed, but they screw up on the micro efficiencies. You see what he's doing? That's why he wants the state to control the market so you don't get these macro inefficiencies, and then you avoid the micro inefficiencies of the planning. Get rid of that. And no matter the problems in the market, it's the best alternative we have to allocate resources because of these two problems associated with planning: the micro inefficiencies and the too much power to humans. That's his indictment of the former Soviet Union. Let me give you one graph and then I'll stop. If I can summarize his interesting and complex argument. And then I'll give you a criticism, like we did for the others, after the break. So we'll come back and we'll criticize all this. But first, let's get his argument. Let's see. Here's the USSR, here's the United States. He's saying, in the Soviet Union, the planners set that price. So the planners in the Soviet Union, historically, say that's consumer goods. They set a price that was too low. And they didn't allow the market to react. The planners, by law, set this price, and that was a ceiling price. And the prices could not rise. That was the price in the stores. So you had in that society an excess demand that could not be solved. You had people queuing up for the scarce consumer goods. There's all kinds of funny stories and movies about this. They didn't produce enough toilet paper, so you had people queuing up for toilet paper. And this encouraged illegal markets in the former Soviet Union, and discord and anger in the retail shops. Because there wasn't sufficient goods for the demand at that price, and so you had an inefficient allocation of resources. They should have been producing more, they did not. So the planners created consumer dissatisfaction, which helped to end those societies. Interesting. He's not going to want to make that. Okay, on this side, on this one. In U.S. capitalism, we have the opposite. On U.S. capitalism, we have these monopolists setting this floor price. U.S. capitalism, the monopolists set a price above the equilibrium. So we're continually having the problem in the U.S. of an excess supply at that price. The monopolists won't lower their price because they got the power to maximize profits right there. So what we end up in the United States is a craziness of continual advertising to shift the demand curve to the right to get rid of the excess supply, whereas what should happen, we should cut the prices. But the monopolist is charging a too high price, where the marginal revenue curve cuts the supply. So the prices are too high in the States, and then you have businesses wanting to produce more at that price, but they can't, because that's the price which maximizes their profits, and hence they use non-price mechanisms to make us buy more, which is called advertising. So we spend a fortune of money on advertising, Super Bowl, whereas in the Soviet Union they do the opposite. Here the planners screw up by charging too low prices, and then people get angry and upset. Here people get manipulated by that. It's a mess. That's his critique of modern-day capitalism and what existed in the Soviet Union. So what he wants is get rid of this crap. Break up the state bureaucrats having too much power. Break up the corporations in which there's too much power in the hands of private bureaucrats, and create competitive markets in both societies. He really does want, and he really is an Adam Smith notion of how a society should produce its wealth. I'll see you after the break. Right here. Right.
Yeah, they try to ask.
Yeah.
You read like,